We have one more talk. Yeah. Alejandro, Fábregas-Tejeda.
Perfect. Thank you so much. All right. Thanks to Alan and Sander and all the organizing team for putting together such an intellectually stimulating meeting. In his presidential address to the 9th International Congress of Logic, Methodology and Philosophy of Science, British philosopher Jonathan Cohen remarked, "A problem exists about the nature of what we're doing when, as philosophers of science, we argue about, say, the structure of scientific theories or the fundamental assumptions of particular sciences. If these topics demand philosophical concern, then so too does the philosophy of science itself. You may think that you, as a practicing philosopher of science, know what the philosophy of science is. But do you, any more than the ordinary practicing scientist knows reflectively and self-consciously what science is? You may think you know how the structure and methods of the philosophy of science differ from one type of issue to another. But do you, any more than the ordinary practicing scientist can articulate just how scientific reasoning differs from one area of science to another? Or just as some practicing scientists regard the philosophy of science as worthless and unproductive activity, so too you, as a practicing philosopher of science, may despise the metaphilosophy of science. But is the latter attitude any more defensible than the former?" Cohen then decried the lack of a specialized section on metaphilosophy in the Congress and finished with an admonition. Quote, "You should not leave the Congress without having taken at least some advantage of the opportunity to reflect on the nature of philosophy of science." If Cohen were addressing this audience today, his advocacy for self-reflexivity perhaps wouldn't be needed. He might, after all, be preaching to the choir. Over the last 3 days, we have been devoting our attention to thinking about what philosophy of science has been, is, and could be in the future. We have been engaging in different ways and with diverse emphasis in historicized, contemporarily contextualized, and forward-looking metaphilosophy of science. These reflections are timely because if we peer into our current juncture, we face an important realization. When we browse through the pages of the main journals in our disciplines, glance at the meetings of diverse societies, track the research conducted at the main centers, and observe how different graduate programs around the world are structured and what they prioritize in teaching and training contexts, we see that the contemporary landscape of philosophy of science is marked by a large diversity of heterogeneous, yet coexisting approaches, styles, schools, and traditions. This includes philosophy of science in practice, meta-theoretical structuralism, formal philosophy of science, integrated HPS, philosophy in science, analytic metaphysics of science, digital philosophy of science, feminist philosophy of science, socially engaged relevant philosophy, and so on and so forth. In this state of affairs, questions regarding the scope, unity, and disunity of philosophy of science are ripe for debate. Indeed, what, if anything, connects these contrasting approaches under the same banner? Should we strive for more cohesion and common ground, or should we rather give up an ideal of unity, say following certain epistemic or methodological paths, and better start speaking about philosophies of science? Maybe philosophical reflections about and in dialogue with the sciences cannot and shouldn't be tamed, and this plurality is a healthy sign of what's to come. However, others might rejoin. Aren't the boundaries of philosophy of science becoming increasingly blurred? What about our disciplinary identity? What kind of weird platypus are we becoming? These expansive questions are not meant to be answered by a single individual, let alone by me. They demand collective reflections on what we want philosophy of science to mean and be. The key issue, I believe, beyond preoccupations about scope, unity, and disunity, is to explore the kinds of questions that can be effectively addressed by each approach, along with the particular rationales, biases, and limitations. This is so because some of the disagreements we observed might be rooted in divergent meta-theoretical positions and meta-philosophical commitments and expectations, not least on what it even means to do philosophy of science. Therefore, it is important, I think, to make strides to cultivate second-order reflections on our activities, which could prove a platform for providing productive discussions and avoiding unnecessary polarization. My goal in the next 10 minutes is to briefly outline the possible contours of a metaphilosophy of science that we, scholars hailing from different backgrounds and assorted career stages, might choose to collectively pursue. Through metaphilosophy of science, we could examine the fundamental concepts, assumptions, and methods that underpin the philosophy of science itself. Metaphilosophical investigations could be aimed at conducting the best kind of philosophy of science that we can through critical self-reflexivity. Now, before moving forward, it is important to clarify that the very idea of metaphilosophy of science is not novel by any means. Indeed, many philosophers of science, including those in the canon of our discipline, have cultivated metaphilosophical reflections. Many examples of this could be cited, for example, the discussion on what constituted scientific philosophy in the late 19th century and early 20th century, or Carnap's characterization of philosophy as the logic of science, which was mentioned in this meeting. At the same time, throughout recent history, the metaphilosophical wanderings of certain philosophers of science have not gone unnoticed, and not everyone has been happy about them. For instance, in Conjectures and Refutations, Popper voices his opinions about the irrelevance of this path and instead commends fellow scholars, "A philosopher should philosophize. He should try to solve philosophical problems rather than talk about philosophy." Funnily enough, Popper says this in a chapter that is thoroughly metaphilosophical, expounding the purported nature of philosophical problems. Moreover, it is important to remember that many of the central discussions that shaped 20th century philosophy of science carry strong metaphilosophical baggage, even if not always explicitly labeled as such. For instance, bring to mind the debate over where philosophical work should fall in the descriptive-normative divide concerning science, for example, advancing close-to-practice characterizations of factual scientific work or proposing regulative ideals of how science ought to unfold. Another example is the contested relationship between philosophy and history of science, a problem at the same time metaphilosophical and metahistorical. In addition to this, one could pinpoint to a certainly growing corpus of works on the metaphilosophies of towering figures in the field, including Carnap, Neurath, Dewey, Popper, Nagel, Hempel, Feyerabend. Alan also spoke about Feigel's metaphilosophy, and Thomas also covered the bipartite meta theory conception of the unity of science group. And in recent years, some metaphilosophical articles have continued to be published, targeting particular issues. For example, different kinds of normativity at play in the philosophy of science, how to bring in digital humanities tools or qualitative methods to the discipline, the issue of extrapolation and drawing licensed inferences from case studies, the testability of meta-theories, disclosing the images of science implicit in philosophical work, or the classic discussion by Van Fraassen on stances that has been very influential to frame the realism and anti-realism debate, among other examples that could be cited. But while it is true that many philosophers, past and present, have engaged in metaphilosophical musings, a cohesive and integrated field of discourse, akin to what exists in other branches of philosophy like metaethics, metaepistemology, or metametaphysics, is hitherto lacking. My suggestion is to try to counter the fragmentation of metaphilosophical reflections and articulate them in a larger discursive field that is able to reach wider audiences. This might also imply moving from implicit metaphilosophy, something that many of us do without noticing, to explicit metaphilosophy, namely being able to reveal assumptions and connect and weave discussions with larger metaphilosophical debates and concerns. Let me give you an example of this. In recent years, more and more explicit discussions on the methods of philosophy of science have been advanced. For example, the topical collection on metaphilosophy of formal methods, edited by Samuel Fletcher in Synthèse. Along these lines, Sophie Feigl and Adrian Curry are currently co-editing an exciting and much-needed volume on different methods in philosophy of science, covering conceptual analysis, thought experiments, to Alan's dismay, formal modeling, experimental philosophy, qualitative interviews, among many others. This will be a great introduction for the uninitiated and could also be an entryway for discovering different avenues on how to tackle problems that keep us awake at night. Of course, in these discussions, many questions lie in the background. Why do we adopt certain methods and not others? Why do these methods actually help us to achieve? How could we know if we have adopted the wrong method to tackle a particular problem? If we bring in a larger metaphilosophical lens, we can come to see that issues about our choice of methods cannot be entirely disentangled from questions about the aims of philosophy of science and what we ultimately believe these are. Is philosophy of science about explaining science or understanding its socio-material contexts and the epistemic goals it yields? Is it about collaborating with scientists to reach certain goals, or perhaps it is about exposing the biases of scientists? Or is it rather about intervening in science, say, to improve concrete practices or standards of theorization? Depending on what we uphold as the central aim of philosophy of science, certain methods would seem to us better suited or justified than others. which we might find, I don't know, pointless, old-fashioned, or perhaps far removed from how traditional philosophy of science has labored the terrain. And as Fons hinted at on Thursday, historically there has been, and right now there is room for disagreement about the aims of philosophy of science. I think serious collective reflections on these issues are needed, as are new appraisals of some of the perennial metaphilosophical questions that philosophers of science have struggled with. These include, but are not limited to, normative and descriptive issues concerning the relationship between philosophy of science and science. And of course, such issues involve considerations of whether and to what extent different brands of naturalism should be embraced, if at all. Likewise, espousing a second-order perspective can advance our comprehension of the intersections and relations between philosophy of science and adjacent fields of knowledge, contributing to building new interdisciplinary dynamics that we so urgently need in the 21st century. In particular, the role that philosophy of science should play in academia and beyond is a metaphilosophical quandary that deserves more attention. Along these lines, we need to address what kind of ethical political positionings we should adopt as philosophers of science in a world with wars, injustice, ethnocentrism, environmental emergencies, and what is really within our sphere of action. Maybe some of you at this point are thinking, just finished already, Alejandro, all of this is stuff that we've been doing anyway, that we've been discussing in this conference, and that we will continue doing regardless of explicitly quoting it under the label of metaphilosophy of science. So can you at least point to unexplored directions as to where this label might lead us? To this, I could reply by listing two of my early stage projects, but precisely because I think this should be a collective endeavor, it is a joint task to carve out new directions for metaphilosophical inquiries. Of course, suggestions and collaborations are more than welcome. The first project, in partnership with my colleague Guido Prieto, tries to apply what we have learned about scientific models and modeling to philosophical work. We seem to not always be aware that philosophers, and not only those that employ formal tools, also sometimes build abstract, incomplete, idealized models of science and scientific activities. We are, of course, at the risk of pernicious reification, of the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, if we don't gain awareness that we're actually handling models in certain occasions. We want to argue that philosophers also face the modeler's dilemma with all its advantages and disadvantages. The second project involves spelling out and putting into dialogue two different approaches to building a general philosophy of science. The first is the one that we are all used to, which relies on adopting a synoptic, top-down route, for example, taking certain abstracts and projectable ideas about, say, causation, explanation, modeling, scientific change, etc., assuming they hold in different sciences, and in some instances, probing to see if this is the case or not, and then revising. The other way, which has not been fully attempted before, I think, would be to try to build from the bottom up, so to speak, a different kind of general philosophy of science by combining and integrating the insights and ideas stemming from the philosophies of the special sciences. My hunch at the moment is that only by combining the top-down and bottom-up approaches is that we can achieve a genuine general philosophy of science that is not philosophy of a particular special science in disguise or abstract stargazing. Now, to finish up, let me give a partial list of suggestions on how we could foster metaphilosophy of science. In our local, immediate contexts, we could start by including it in our teaching. Consider offering a small module in your next introduction to philosophy of science. One class might suffice. Talk about this with your grad students when they are struggling with their methods. And once in a while, put your own research projects under scrutiny from a metaphilosophical vantage point. On what metaphilosophical assumptions do they hinge? Countenance the possibility that some of the disagreements you are vehemently taking part in might be due to metaphilosophical commitments, and the way to solve them won't be by writing yet another reply and a response to objections in your favorite journal. In the midterm, we could organize targeted workshops and try to put together large research groups with people of diverse expertise. We might also start publishing monographs and edited collections on metaphilosophy of science to have resources for students and do more scholarly research. And of course, we should continue organizing meetings like this one, so kudos to Alan and Sander once more. And in the long term, maybe it would be a good idea to start new journals and societies to flesh out metaphilosophical concerns, although another possible route could be to continue having it embedded in philosophy of science journals and societies, as it has been the case until now. But please share your ideas with me or between each other. All right, thank you very much for listening, and let me take this opportunity to thank my teachers, mentors, and colleagues at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, Ruhr University Bochum, and KU Leuven, because thanks to them, I am the philosopher that I am today, and there's not always chance to appreciate this. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much. This follows really nicely from Heisen's presentation, and also in a way calls back to Olas's presentation yesterday. Yeah. So thanks for this nice coherence. I think I'm broadly on board with what you're doing here, and you've given us an invitation to think about some really nice metaphilosophical questions. So that's on the one hand, one thing you're doing. But there's also another thing that you're doing here, which is giving us a kind of problem that you think metaphilosophical reflection is well positioned to solve. And so I just wanted to ask you a little bit more about that. You've probably already thought about what I'm going to say, but I'm just curious to hear your response. So here's the idea. So you've posed that like metaphilosophical reflection might be a way to solve this fragmentation problem. And the fragmentation problem is something like we've got a bunch of different ways of doing philosophy of science going on in the field, in different fields now. Maybe it's one field, maybe it's a bunch of different fields collected together under philosophy of science. What we can do is just reflect on how those approaches have different sorts of metaphilosophical commitments, and then maybe find some kind of like coherence or unity or something. I don't know, you didn't say specifically, I'm just like filling in some blanks here. So the question is really like, why do you think that kind of fragmentation problem is best resolved by direct or explicit discussion of metaphilosophical commitments? Because you might think that that's just a way of kind of reinscribing the same sort of fragmentation, but at a second order level.
No, thank you very much. Fantastic points. Maybe I was not clear enough. I'm not advocating for unity or disunity of philosophy of science. I'm simply inviting all of us here to think about metaphilosophical issues more seriously and in a more collaborative and international way. In this sense, I don't necessarily think that only spelling out the metaphilosophical commitment of all of these different approaches will help us find a solution about what to do with the fragmentation or not. I think that discussion needs to happen beforehand. Like, what are the aims of philosophy of science, right? If we collectively decide that perhaps we want to move the field in one direction onto another, then fragmentation could be a problem or could be a really good advantage, right? If we want to tackle several issues at once, or perhaps, find some middle ground. So I have not thought very deeply about precisely this one, so I will continue to reflect on it, and maybe in some minutes I will have something else to say in the coffee break. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Very thought-provoking. We've seen and discussed yesterday, I think a little at least, that the function that philosophy of science may have for science is not really clear. And here are the two poles. Philosophy of science should improve the science, or philosophy of science should help us understanding science. Now, when I transpose this difference to your talk, I think implicitly, at least, you have the hope that the meta-philosophy of science will improve the philosophy of science. I was quite pessimistic about that concerning the one level down. So what gives you the optimism that this meta-philosophy of science will improve philosophy of science?
Well, yeah. No, excellent point. Gives me the optimism of having such an amazing group of people thinking together and try to solve these complex issues. In that sense, that's why I think could be optimistic to think that metaphilosophy of science could help improve philosophy of science, which of course is my own hope. you picked up well my own metaphilosophical position about this. I really think that metaphilosophy of science, exactly, could help improve metaphilosophy of science. But one could also take the more pessimistic view. Perhaps it won't help us to improve it, but at least to understand it better, like what we're doing when we say we're doing philosophy of science. And I think that's also valuable in itself, because if we get a good grasp of what philosophy of science is, then we could see how it connects to other fields in the humanities, and that we can do other sort of things. So not necessarily improving the practices, or not being able to improve the practices of philosophy of science would be a bad outcome, but also understanding philosophy of science, I think it's worthwhile in itself through metaphilosophical reflection. But all of this is up for debate. Maybe other aims should be prioritized instead of intervening in or understanding philosophy of science.
Final question, Brian.
Thanks. I wonder about your reflections on philosophizing about philosophy of science as compared to developing methodologies for philosophy of science. There's an aspect of the latter that is, very clearly helping to improve the field, but it's less clear that it's generally philosophical. For example, if we're doing, sometimes in grad courses, we're doing sort of methodologies sessions where you might just be learning real probability theory because it's so disastrous what philosophers often do with this topic. Well, so what does one, is there a tension between those sorts of things? It's like, another interesting comparison is metamathematics, which many people consider to just be an area of mathematics. So a lot of what you were saying suggested philosophy of science just is an area of philosophy of science. We're just doing first order philosophy. It's not just talking about philosophy like Popper suggests, it's actually philosophizing. But, sort of if your aim is to improve the field, actually a lot of it isn't necessarily doing philosophy. It could be doing science, for example, or developing methodologies. So I wonder about that role in your thinking.
Yeah, no, well, for me, it's not particularly crucial to resolve if metaphilosophy of science is a branch of philosophy of science or is a second-order reflection or a different discipline. I think that issue in itself is not the most relevant part of it. Regarding methods, of course, I think that one important contribution that metaphilosophy of science can do is developing new methods. But I think that the reflection only in methodology is not enough for really having a thorough picture of philosophy of science, right? We can also try to spell out what are the metaphysical commitments of particular views. And this is not exhausted only by developing methods or scrutinizing existing methods. So I think that opening up the possibility of doing metaphilosophy that is not just methodology gives you a larger spectrum of potential fields in which, or potential areas in which you could, either intervene or think more deeply about. This is what I would say up front.